The summer of 1943 hung heavy over occupied France. In a requisitioned chateau outside Caen, German officers gathered around a long oak table, their uniforms crisp despite the war grinding into its fourth year. Someone had brought captured American intelligence reports, thin folders stamped with red ink, detailing something the Wehrmacht found amusing: airborne infantry. Fallschirmjäger from the sky, one Oberst laughed, pouring cognac from a bottle that had belonged to the French family who once lived there. The Americans think they can float down like dandelion seeds and conquer Europe. The room erupted in knowing chuckles. These were men who had rolled through Poland in weeks, crushed France in 40 days, and pushed deep into the Soviet Union. They had seen blitzkrieg triumph through speed, armor, and ruthless coordination on the ground. The idea that soldiers dropped from aircraft, scattered, disoriented, vulnerable, could pose any real threat seemed absurd. A propaganda stunt. American theatrics. Outside the chateau windows, the French countryside stretched green and deceptive in its tranquility. Church bells still rang on Sundays. Farmers still worked their fields, though now under the watchful eyes of occupation forces. The Germans had fortified this land with concrete and steel, with minefields and beach obstacles, with the unshakable confidence that comes from victory after victory. But confidence, history teaches us, can calcify into arrogance. And arrogance makes men blind. In those smoke-filled rooms, as glasses clinked and cigarettes glowed, the German officers dismissed what they could not yet understand, that warfare was about to change in ways their textbooks never predicted. That the sky itself was becoming a new front. That somewhere across the English Channel, thousands of young Americans were learning to do something no army had ever attempted at scale, to transform the air into an invasion route, to turn gravity into a weapon, to arrive not with the thunder of tanks but with the whisper of silk canopies against a midnight sky. They laughed because they had never seen it. They mocked because it seemed impossible. But in the alchemy of war, the impossible has a way of becoming inevitable. And the laughter echoing through that chateau would soon fade into something else entirely, something that tasted like fear and felt like respect earned in blood. The storm was gathering. They just couldn't see it yet. Rewind to 1940. While Europe burned, the United States Army faced an uncomfortable truth: it was unprepared for modern war. American generals watched newsreels of German paratroopers seizing Fort Ebenemehl in Belgium, a fortress thought impregnable, taken in hours by soldiers who landed on its roof. The message was clear and terrifying: the rules had changed. But learning a new kind of warfare meant starting from scratch. When the U.S. Army established its parachute test platoon in 1940, it consisted of 48 volunteers and a dangerous amount of optimism. At Fort Benning, Georgia, engineers jury-rigged parachutes from designs barely tested, towers from which men would practice their exits, and training regiments that seemed designed to break spirits before they broke bones. "You want me to jump out of a perfectly good airplane," became the dark joke whispered among the first recruits. And there was truth in the humor. This was psychological warfare before the enemy ever appeared. Every natural instinct screamed against stepping into empty air 3,000 feet above Georgia clay. The army had to rewire survival instincts, to train men to embrace the fall. Major William Lee, often called the father of American airborne forces, understood something crucial: you couldn't order men to become paratroopers. They had to volunteer for their own destruction. So the army offered extra pay, $50 a month, a fortune in Depression-era America, and something more valuable, the promise of being elite. Of wearing boots that bloused differently, of earning silver wings that marked you as something special. The training sorted men with brutal efficiency. 5-mile runs before dawn. Endless hours packing and repacking parachutes, because your life depended on every fold being perfect. Tower jumps where the ground rushed up and your legs remembered, with shocking clarity, that humans were never meant to fly. And then the real jumps, the door opening, the wind screaming, the green light flickering, and that eternal second when you had to choose between stepping forward or living forever with the knowledge that you couldn't. Many washed out. Some broke legs. A few died in training accidents that the army tried to keep quiet, afraid the entire experiment would be cancelled. Because that's what it was, an experiment. Nobody knew if you could drop thousands of men behind enemy lines and have them fight effectively. The logistics alone seemed impossible. How do you resupply paratroopers? How do they link up when scattered across miles? How do they hold ground until conventional forces arrive? But by 1942, the US had activated the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions. Thousands of men wearing those hard-earned silver wings, practicing night jumps over English fields, preparing for something they couldn't quite imagine. The skeptics within the army remained vocal: too expensive, too risky, too unproven. But the believers saw something else, a way to appear anywhere, instantly, before the enemy could react. A way to turn surprise into a strategic weapon. The question wasn't whether American paratroopers could fight. The question was whether they'd get the chance to prove it before the skeptics won. That answer would come under a Mediterranean sun, in the chaos of Sicily, where theory would collide with the brutal reality of war. July 9, 1943. The first major American airborne operation of the war began with nearly everything going wrong. Over the Mediterranean, 266 CA-47 transport planes carrying 3,400 paratroopers from the 82nd Airborne approached Sicily through darkness and wind that scattered the formations like leaves. Pilots, many on their first combat mission, struggled to find landmarks on the blacked-out coast. Anti-aircraft fire erupted from both German and Italian positions, and then, horrifically, from Allied ships offshore who mistook the lumbering transports for enemy bombers. Tracers cut through the night sky. Planes banked hard, engines screaming, trying to evade friendly fire. Some caught flame and spun toward the sea. Others dropped their paratroopers miles from intended zones, some over mountains, some into the ocean, some directly onto enemy positions. The careful plans, the rehearsed coordination, evaporated into chaos. Private Ed Sayer landed in an olive grove, alone, his stick scattered across 10 miles of hostile territory. His leg twisted on landing, a bad sprain, maybe broken. His radio was silent. He could hear gunfire in multiple directions but had no idea where friendly lines began or ended. This was the nightmare scenario planners had feared. Thousands of soldiers dropped blind into enemy territory, without communication, without support, fighting their own private wars in the dark. But something unexpected happened. Instead of surrendering or hiding, these scattered paratroopers did what their training had only theorized: they improvised. Small groups found each other using crickets, little metal clickers that became identification signals. They ambushed German convoys, cut communications lines, created havoc disproportionate to their numbers. A squad of 12 men held a crossroads against a German company for 6 hours. A lieutenant with 30 paratroopers seized a coastal battery, preventing it from shelling invasion beaches. The official after-action reports would be damning: excessive casualties, missed objectives, organizational failure. But on the ground, where German commanders tried to coordinate defenses, something else was happening. They couldn't pin down where the Americans were. Reports flooded in from everywhere: paratroopers here, sabotage there, firefights erupting in their rear areas. The psychological impact multiplied the actual force. The Germans had to hold back reserves, chase shadows, defend everywhere because Americans seemed to be nowhere and everywhere simultaneously. And the paratroopers learned the most important lesson: they could survive alone. When everything went wrong, and it would, always, in airborne operations, when you were dropped in the wrong place with half your equipment missing and no support coming, you could still fight. You could still win. Sicily wasn't pretty. It wasn't the textbook victory anyone wanted. But it was proof that the concept worked, that paratroopers weren't a propaganda stunt but a genuine weapon. The Germans stopped laughing after Sicily. They started preparing. Because if the Americans could do this in chaos, what would happen when they got it right? That answer was coming. Its code name was Overlord. England in the spring of 1944 became a vast rehearsal stage for invasion. Across the countryside, in requisitioned estates and muddy fields, the American airborne divisions trained with an intensity born from Sicily's harsh lessons. The training evolved beyond individual jumps into something far more complex: mass formations, night operations, objective-based missions. At airfields across southern England, entire battalions practiced loading procedures until they could board 100 aircraft in under 20 minutes. Pilots flew night navigation courses, learning to read terrain by moonlight, to recognize landmarks that would be invisible under blackout conditions. Engineers designed new equipment, leg bags for heavy weapons, improved parachutes, radar beacons, colored smoke signals. But the most crucial training happened in the dark. Because D-Day, whenever it came, would begin at night, with paratroopers dropping hours before the beach landings. So they practiced in darkness, jumping at midnight over English farms, learning to assemble by sound and touch, to fight with minimal visibility. Local villagers grew accustomed to the drone of aircraft engines after midnight, to finding parachutes tangled in their trees the next morning, to young Americans asking directions in broken English after landing miles off course. The paratroopers studied sand tables and aerial photographs until they could navigate their drop zones blind. They memorized German defensive positions, bridge structures, causeway layouts. They practiced with live ammunition, because training deaths were preferable to combat failures. And they cross-trained. Every man learned to operate multiple weapons, to render first aid, to demolish bridges or defend them, because in airborne operations, you fought with whoever landed near you, regardless of rank or specialty. Glider pilots, men who would fly engineless aircraft loaded with jeeps and artillery into combat, practiced landing in impossibly small fields. Their training was perhaps most unforgiving. Once you released from the tow plane, you had one chance to land correctly. No engine meant no second approach. The fields of England were scarred with crash landing marks, each one a lesson learned, a mistake that wouldn't be repeated over France. General Eisenhower visited often, watching the night jumps, talking with the men who would go first. He understood the stakes. If the paratroopers failed, if they couldn't seize and hold the bridges and causeways inland from the beaches, the entire invasion could collapse. The Germans could rush reinforcements to the coast, pin the beach forces against the sea, turn Normandy into a slaughter. But if the paratroopers succeeded, if they could create chaos behind German lines, seize vital choke points, and hold until relief arrived, then the invasion had a chance. Everything depended on soldiers falling from the sky in darkness, scattered and alone, doing the impossible before dawn. As May turned to June, the training intensified. The men knew something massive was coming. They could feel it in the air, in the urgency of final briefings, in the way officers checked equipment with unusual care. The rehearsal was ending. The performance was about to begin. June 5, 1944. Across a dozen airfields in southern England, paratroopers blackened their faces with cork ash and loaded into C-47s. Their pockets bulged with ammunition, grenades, rations, and letters from home that many had just finished writing. Some wouldn't be mailed. The weight was crushing, 60 to 80 pounds of equipment per man, so much that they needed help climbing into the aircraft. Lieutenant Richard Winters of the 101st Airborne watched his men joke nervously as they checked each other's parachutes. The routine was sacred now: tug the straps, verify the static line, ensure the reserve chute was accessible. Each man was responsible for the life of the soldier in front of him. Trust wasn't optional. At 2,256 hours, engines coughed to life. One by one, the aircraft rolled down runways and climbed into the darkness, forming streams that stretched across the English Channel. Inside the planes, men sat knee to knee, too loaded with gear to move easily, feeling the vibration of engines through metal floors. Some prayed. Some slept with the exhaustion of soldiers who've learned to rest whenever possible. Some stared at nothing, lost in thoughts of home, or tomorrow, or the fact that in 2 hours they'd be falling through darkness over occupied France. The Channel crossing was eerily smooth. Moonlight painted the water silver. From the open doors, some paratroopers could see the invasion fleet below, thousands of ships converging on Normandy, the largest amphibious assault in history. But those men on the ships wouldn't land for hours yet. The paratroopers were going first, alone, into the darkness. Then France appeared below, and everything changed. Anti-aircraft fire erupted, green and orange tracers arcing upward, explosions buffeting the aircraft. Planes scattered from formation, diving and climbing to evade the flak. Inside, paratroopers were thrown against bulkheads, their careful seating arrangements collapsing into chaos. Some men vomited from the violent maneuvering. Others prayed louder. The red light came on. Stand up. Hook up. The rituals performed 1,000 times in training, now executed in genuine terror. Shuffling toward the door, feeling the prop blast, seeing tracers cut the darkness outside. The green light flickered. Go. 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 And they went. One after another, stepping into a night lit by muzzle flashes and burning aircraft. The opening shock jerked them hard, and then they were floating in the strange silence above the battlefield, watching tracers arc past, hearing distant explosions, trying to find landmarks that were supposed to be there but weren't, because almost every pilot had dropped their stick in the wrong location. Private First Class John Steele's parachute caught on the church steeple in St. Miraglise, leaving him dangling above the town square where German soldiers fought American paratroopers in a vicious close-quarters battle. He played dead for 2 hours, watching the battle below, until Germans cut him down and took him prisoner. Most weren't so lucky. Some drowned in flooded fields, weighed down by equipment. Others landed in German positions and died before touching ground. Many broke bones on landing and fought anyway. By 0200 hours, 13,000 American paratroopers were scattered across Normandy, most miles from their drop zones, many injured, all alone in darkness, beginning the fight that would decide D-Day's success. In the pre-dawn darkness of June 6, a small stone bridge near St. Miraglise became the unlikely fulcrum of fate. The La Fire Causeway, a narrow raised road crossing flooded marshland, represented one of the few routes inland from Utah Beach. If the Germans held it, they could pour reinforcements toward the beach. If the Americans controlled it, they could link the beach forces with the paratroopers and push deeper into France. Lieutenant Colonel Benjamin von der Fort landed badly, breaking his ankle on impact. But there was no time for medical evacuation, no possibility of standing down. He had men to lead and a bridge to take. Using a rifle as a crutch, he hobbled toward the sound of gunfire, gathering scattered paratroopers along the way. By dawn, he'd assembled maybe 200 men, a fraction of his battalion, from half a dozen different units, some he'd never met before. They reached La Fire to find a handful of paratroopers already engaged in a desperate firefight with German forces on the far side. The bridge was intact but impassable. German machine guns commanded the entire causeway. Anyone trying to cross was cut down in seconds. Bodies floated in the flooded fields on either side, evidence of earlier failed attempts. Von der Fort assessed the situation with the cold clarity of a man who understood there were no good options, only necessary ones. They couldn't bypass the bridge, the flooded fields extended for hundreds of yards on both sides, too deep to wade, too exposed to cross. They couldn't wait for reinforcements because German armor was coming, and if it reached the bridge first, the position would be unassailable. They had to hold the western approach and prevent the Germans from either destroying the bridge or reinforcing their positions on the far side. What followed was 72 hours of combat that would haunt survivors for the rest of their lives. The paratroopers dug into hedgerows and stone walls, creating fighting positions from whatever materials they could scavenge. German counterattacks came in waves, infantry probes, followed by heavier assaults supported by mortars and artillery. Each attack pushed the Americans closer to breaking. Ammunition ran low. Men rationed rifle rounds, waiting until German soldiers were impossibly close before firing. Medics worked without morphine, doing surgery with field knives and prayer. The wounded lay in ditches because there was nowhere to evacuate them. Some bled out slowly, apologizing to their friends for dying, as if mortality were something to feel guilty about. Private Marcus Heim, a bazooka operator, held his position at the bridge's western edge through 3 consecutive German attacks. When his ammunition ran out, he threw grenades. When the grenades were gone, he fought with his rifle. When his rifle jammed, he used it as a club. He died on the 3rd day, found by relieving forces still gripping his weapon, surrounded by evidence of his defiance. But the bridge held. Despite casualties approaching 50%, despite being outnumbered and outgunned, despite exhaustion and terror and every rational reason to retreat, the paratroopers held La Fire. When the 1st Sherman tanks from the 4th Infantry Division finally rumbled across the causeway on June 9, they rolled over ground purchased with extraordinary courage, a small bridge that had become a monument to what soldiers could achieve when surrender simply wasn't considered an option. The reports reaching German commanders in the days following the invasion carried an unmistakable shift in tone. Gone were the dismissive assessments of American paratroopers as propaganda soldiers. Replacing them were urgent dispatches describing coordinated resistance, captured positions, and an enemy that seemed to materialize from nowhere with devastating effect. A captured German officer's diary, recovered near Carentan, recorded his confusion: "The Americans are not where we expect them. They appear behind our lines, block our supply routes, and vanish before we can engage." How does one fight an enemy that falls from the sky? That question, how does one fight paratroopers, revealed the strategic triumph of airborne operations. The Germans had prepared for a coastal invasion with impressive thoroughness. Their beach defenses were formidable, their artillery positioned to slaughter amphibious forces. But the paratroopers bypassed all of it, landing inland, creating chaos in the rear areas, forcing German commanders to fight in two directions simultaneously. At La Fire, at St. Mireglise, at half a dozen bloody crossroads whose names most people would never learn, American paratroopers had done what German officers deemed impossible. They dropped scattered and disorganized, yet seized and held vital objectives. They'd fought outnumbered, often surrounded, and refused to break. The laughter that had echoed through that chateau months earlier was conspicuously absent from German communications now. What replaced it was something more valuable than fear: it was respect. The kind of respect soldiers grant to enemies who prove themselves in combat. German troops began to understand that American paratroopers weren't undertrained, weren't unprepared, weren't the soft soldiers their propaganda had promised. These were men who would fight to the last round, who would hold impossible positions, who transformed determination into a tactical advantage. The strategic impact rippled beyond Normandy. German forces across France began expecting airborne assaults everywhere, forcing them to spread defenses thinner, to maintain reserves against attacks that might never come. The psychological warfare of paratroopers, the fear of soldiers appearing from the sky, had become as potent as the physical presence of troops on the ground. By mid-June, as Allied forces pushed deeper into France, the airborne divisions had earned something they'd lacked before Sicily, before the chaos of Normandy, before La Fire. They'd earned their place in military history. Not as an experimental unit or propaganda tool, but as a genuine weapon that had changed how wars would be fought. The sky was no longer a barrier. It was a highway for soldiers brave enough, or crazy enough, to travel it. Today, if you visit La Fire, you'll find a quiet bridge in the Norman countryside. Cows graze in fields once flooded to deter invaders. The hedgerows have grown wild again. There's a small monument, often overlooked by tourists racing toward more famous D-Day beaches, commemorating the paratroopers who fought there. But stand on that bridge at dawn, when mist rises from the fields and the world is silent, and you can almost hear the echoes, the drone of CR-47 engines, the crack of rifle fire, the voices of men who did something they weren't sure was possible until they'd already done it. The veterans, those who survived, carried La Fire with them forever. In interviews decades later, their eyes would grow distant when asked about the bridge. Some could still recite the names of friends who died there. Others preferred silence, understanding that some truths are too heavy for words. But all of them shared a quiet pride, not in the killing, not in the glory, but in having stood when standing seemed impossible. The legacy of those first American paratroopers extends beyond military tactics. They proved that courage isn't the absence of fear but the decision to act despite it. That training and determination could overcome chaos. That impossible orders could become accomplished missions if enough people refused to quit. The German officers who laughed in 1943 weren't stupid men, they were simply prisoners of their own experience, unable to imagine warfare they hadn't yet seen. The paratroopers taught them, at great cost to both sides, that war evolves, that yesterday's impossible becomes tomorrow's standard operation. And every modern airborne soldier, in every nation, who steps from an aircraft into empty sky, carries with them the legacy of those first drops over Sicily and Normandy, the knowledge that sometimes the hardest part isn't the fall, but having the courage to jump. The bridge at La Fire still stands. And so does their memory.